So welcome very much. We've been looking forward to meeting you all, and you're welcome to ask questions that you have either through the presentations or afterwards as you feel. My name is Anne Olhoff. I'm the head of our Climate Resilient Development Program here at UNEP DTU Partnership, and we hope to have an exciting day here together. So basically, as Rayong already said, we've structured these parallel sessions pretty much in accordance with the outline of the adaptation contribution that my colleagues went through this morning. So right now we're focusing on the first point on the rationale of the process, and then on the third point on ways to report on both long-term and shorter-term adaptation goals and targets. So the aim of this first session is basically to give you an overview of the framework conditions and also some of the potential options for developing INDCs on adaptation. It'll be quite short. Then secondly, what we think is important is to allow you and give you some time and opportunity to also exchange views and discuss critical issues and some of the experiences from your ongoing processes on INDC development. And then finally, we would very much like you to also give us specific feedback on how we can best support you in this process of developing INDCs on adaptation. So those are the three main aims of this first session. And I will do the first part, and then my colleague Skylar will take over with some more specific examples. So what's the point of departure? Well, obviously it's the Lima Call for Action, for climate action, where it's stated that all parties are invited to consider communicating their undertakings in adaptation planning, or consider including an adaptation component in the INDCs. So that's all good and well, but it raises a number of questions as well. And what we're going to focus on right now is here, why should we develop an INDC on adaptation? How can it be done? We're not going to go into a lot of detail on that. And finally, what could it look like? What could it include? So these are all critical questions. And actually, the Lima Call for Climate Action does not provide a whole lot of guidance on these critical issues. First of all, INDCs on adaptation, as you all know, are optional. So it's left open to countries to decide whether they want to include adaptation or not in their INDCs. They're also very flexible. As you just saw in the previous slides, it's left open to countries whether they want to include it in the INDC or basically communicating action undertakings in adaptation planning and action. And you can say that one of the INDCs that has been submitted, the one from Norway, mentions the adaptation but actually refers to their national adaptation plan. So you can say that's sort of more reporting on the undertakings than actually including it specifically in the INDC, or it's somewhere in the middle maybe. And furthermore, it's very flexible because there are no specifications of how to include it in terms of format or specific instruments for including it. So very flexible. Thirdly, there's a lot of uncertainty or unknown surrounding the INDCs on adaptation. We don't know what their function will be within the UNFCCC yet. We don't know whether they will undergo some kind of review. We don't know whether they will be used to inform the Adaptation Committee and the UNFCCC decisions, or how they will be used to do so. And finally, we don't exactly know what the role of adaptation INDCs will be in relation to the different funding bodies, not least the Green Climate Funds. So basically, we're starting from a clean slate. And all of this also implies that it's quite open to countries to interpret the function of their adaptation INDC, both in accordance with national priorities and national development strategies and plans, and also in terms of putting in the INDC on adaptation, sort of setting the direction for how countries would like to see adaptation included in the global agreement that we all hope is going to come out of the Paris COP later this year. So moving on to the why. This slide just presents some examples of rationales that different countries and also different papers have raised. So why include adaptation in your INDC? It could be that you want to raise the profile of adaptation planning, action, and needs, both at national and international level. And it can also be used as a means to articulate a long-term vision in the international context of how to deal with climate change impacts, risks, and how to increase the resilience of people and countries and ecosystems. It can also be used as a way to gain international recognition for the things that are already going on in the countries and have been undertaken. Then I think one important point, and that relates more to how you want to use an adaptation INDC in the context of global negotiations. It can provide quite a lot of pressure in moving from planning to action on adaptation. And as I don't know if this is my personal view, but if we look at mitigation, it's all about actions. It's about reducing emissions, it's very concrete actions. And when we turn to adaptation, it's a lot about planning, processes, and not so much focus on actual doing stuff on the ground. And as you all know, a lot of stuff is going on the ground, and it's time to move that momentum, I think, to the international level and actually focus on getting stuff implemented on the ground. We know enough about what the key problems are, and if we can sort of aggregate that, we could induce, I think we could get larger action at the global scale. But that also requires being more specific about what we want to achieve. What are the goals, the targets? And getting more precise in the language rather than just say we want to increase adaptation capacity or adaptive capacity and so forth. So it has to become more concrete. And the INDCs can help on that by specifying what exactly it is that we want to achieve. We'll get back to that. Then obviously it's also a very good way of specifying and being very concrete on the needs at the country level for support to realize these different objectives for adaptation. And finally, I think a very important way of using the INDCs on adaptation would also be to illustrate and build a platform for sharing lessons on adaptation action from the different countries, what works, what does not work, and creating a sort of shared action or collaboration on addressing these challenges that might be local in by nature, but are also very global by nature. So moving on to how. Of course, the process of preparing INDCs on adaptation are very country specific, and there's no one way to do it. And I'm actually looking very much forward also to hearing more from you about what types of processes you're adopting in your countries. But some of the issues that are relevant to consider is, of course, what are the resources available? We all know that there's very little time left to prepare these INDCs. There might be funding issues as well, and there might be limitations, so at least you should take into account the human resources and expertise available to develop these INDCs. Of course, it should look into the existing institutional and legal and governmental structures and how you want to engage stakeholders, or the extent to which it's possible given the time and other constraints. Then, of course, it should be aligned and take into consideration the national development objectives and goals, and sustainable development goals, of course. And, of course, look into national adaptation priorities, the key vulnerabilities and risks, impacts, and needs, and take into account the existing information at the country level. Since there is so little time and probably limited resources, it's really important to build on ongoing processes, to learn from existing documents, strategies, and studies, and so forth, and use that as an entry point. Skylar will come back to the different entry points. We realize that all of you in this room, your countries will have very different entry points probably for developing INDCs on adaptation. So it's relevant to look a little bit more on the different entry points. Then let's turn to the content, the what. What can an INDC on adaptation include? And now I think we have 5 or 6 INDCs submitted that actually include adaptation components. And I think gradually a certain picture is emerging. These categories that you have on the slide are taken from the template, the INDC submission template that my colleague went through earlier. They're not all of them, but apart from the first one, Envision. And I think generally what we can see is that there's some kind of consensus building around types of information to be included in, or that countries choose to include in the INDCs. Of course, all of this is optional, and countries can choose to focus on one or two and go more into depth with those, and don't have to include everything. Maybe you don't want to divide the division or divide sections between gaps, barriers, and needs. That could all go into one section, but it's just to outline the types of information that you might want to include. Here we go. And just to exemplify, I don't know if this is on the internet. Yeah, it is. This is the INDC from Ethiopia, and it actually includes quite a lot of these categories that I just showed on the slide. If we go to page 4 here, let me just find it. That's where the description of adaptation contribution starts. So you can see here they have the long-term goal, current and near-term action, medium and long-term actions, and those are divided into. Actually, Ethiopia is quite interesting because they focus on more key types of risks and impacts rather than a sectoral approach, which we've seen in many of the other submitted INDCs. So they focus on drought, flood, and other cross-cutting interventions. And then they also include aspects of monitoring and evaluation. And finally, they have chosen to include under means of implementation both those needs related to mitigation and to adaptation. So that was just to illustrate that many of these information categories are actually being used by countries. So for the rest of this presentation, we'll focus on the long-term and more near-term adaptation goals, visions, and targets. So why do countries consider communicating vision, goals, and targets? Well, first of all, it's a way to communicate the ambitions for the future, obviously. It's also sort of a background and a means to highlight what is actually being undertaken at the national level. And then it provides a background for getting to the needs and how those will and can be addressed both domestically and internationally. And there's a tendency to focus on capacity, finance, and technology, obviously given the whole focus of the international negotiations and of the UNFCCC. In addition, countries may want to consider how the national INDC goals link to other global goals, including the Sustainable Development Goals that Gareth mentioned in his presentation on water and coastal issues. And then one quite important part is at the point where countries focus on the goals and targets in a more time-specific context, to think into the equation already here, how are we going to monitor, evaluate, and perhaps even report on these the fulfillment, how we're going to track progress on these on the fulfillment of these goals and targets. Vision, I've just taken two examples from the submitted INDCs and adaptation here. So the first one is Morocco's vision, which focuses very much on preserving its territory and civilization, and on effectively responding to the vulnerabilities and protecting the population as well as economic factors. Then Gabon's is quite different because it focuses on integrating adaptation into a coherent investment framework and in developing an investment fund, sustainable development investment fund, and very much on integrating climate change into development strategies and funding, and sort of moving away from a tendency for very sort of isolated approaches and to both development and climate change. So they're quite quite good examples of different ways of formulating visions that I thought would be nice for you to see. So the vision is more sort of the long-term goal or target, and it can be based on an outcome, or it can be based on more on a process. And if we look more into the different types of goals and targets that you could focus on in the INDCs and adaptation, one type is outcome-based goals and targets, and these are linked to the objective of the convention and also to national priorities, and they can also be expressed both as an aspirational or visionary ambition, or as an initial step towards more concrete targets. So these outcome-based goals and targets, they can both be addressed at national level, or they could be formulated at sectoral or cross-cutting levels, and they can both be qualitative or quantitative by nature. And just to give you some examples of these outcome-based goals or targets, you can see them included here, and some of these, if we take the last one, identify areas at high risk to climate hazards and increase infrastructure spending by X% by year Y. That's an example of one that's quantitative. It has specific targets and a specific time frame, whereas the first one is the more overall, and it's not specifically time bound either, and it's qualitative. So that's just some examples of how outcome-based goals and targets can be expressed. Then you can also look at process-based goals and targets, and they focus more on enhancing planning, on strengthening capacities and governance systems, and putting in place systems that can help mainstream climate change risks into broader development activities. If your starting point is sort of, if many of the underlying strategies, plans, and studies are kind of outdated and so forth, what you might want to do is focus on more process-based goals and targets, saying by this year we will have a national adaptation plan in process, or by this year we will have a national adaptation strategy developed, and so forth. Again, they can be at different levels, from national to very local. They can also be cross-cutting, and they can be qualitative or quantitative. So finally, you can look at needs-based goals and targets, and as the name suggests, these are more focusing on what resources are required to meet these targets and goals that are perhaps formulated at higher levels, and they can help you feed into the whole means of implementation section and so forth. Again, they can be at different levels. They can be qualitative and quantitative, and I've included some examples here. We have a table in the INDC guidance note on adaptation that has some examples in it, and it's basically what I've shown here, but with all the three different types of goals and targets and some specific examples included. We're going to revise these examples a little bit. It's actually sometimes quite difficult to find out whether something is process-based or outcome-based. In some cases, there's an overlap between them. So bear with us a little bit. The version you have is some of the examples need just to be checked once more. In practice, of course, in the INDCs, and that's also with what we see in the ones that have already been submitted, countries will it will be most appropriate, or actually it will be needed to have some kind of combination of these different types of goals, outcome, process, and needs-based. So the vision, as we also saw in the examples from Morocco and Gabon, is typically either outcome or process-based, at national level, and quite long-term by nature, and that can be combined with more specific and time-bound goals and targets at national level, at sectoral level, or by risks, or even local level. And these can both be outcome, process, and needs-based, and in all cases you can have them formulated as quantitative or qualitative goals and targets. And actually, I think I'm going to leave it here and give the word and the floor to my colleague Skylar, who's going to look more into the different entry points and come with some examples, more concrete examples of what I've just shown you. But before I give the word to Skylar, and we can just change the presentation. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, you're most welcome to ask them now, or otherwise you can wait until after Skylar has presented as well. Thank you.
I'll get started. So I'm going to be giving a presentation on developing goals, targets, and rationale through primarily examples from the INDCs submitted and under development. So now that Anna has kind of laid the groundwork on what a vision can be, what a rationale can be, what you could possibly define a target as, I'm going to present some of these examples and try and put it into context a little bit more for you, and give some of the examples of the approaches and the different resources used from some INDCs that have already been submitted or drafted, and look at the targets that they were able to develop as a result. But before I get started into the in-depth examples, it's important to recognize that countries are starting from different entry points. So not all countries are going to have the same resources or have developed the same national planning or communication documents. Everyone's kind of at a different entry point here. So the INDCs, as a result, are going to be highly variable depending on the resources you have, the funding you have, and the support that you have to develop them. So before I kind of launch into it, I'm just kind of hoping I can get a show of hands. I've got, on the PowerPoint here, I've got 3 kind of different entry points that I'm going to be looking at, whether or not you have a NAP or a similar process. The second is whether there's a national climate change or adaptation strategy. And the third is if you may have something, but it might be limited, it might be outdated, or you're not quite there in terms of developing the strategies yet. So in this room, who kind of would place themselves in this first category? Okay, one? Yeah? No one else has a NAP? Okay, and what about the second category? Don't be shy. Okay, so about 4 or 5 of you. And the third? Okay, so most of us fall into category 2, just to kind of get a general idea. And so I'll move on to the case studies. So the first case study I'm going to kind of go into is Chile, because they developed this process with a NAP. The second one will be South Africa, which I know that Emmanuel gave you a very nice presentation on yesterday. And the third will be Gabon. So moving into it. So countries that have a NAP or a similar process, you can draw much of what will become your adaptation component of your INDC from this, meaning that you can pull out a summary of existing analysis and the ongoing activities, a consultation of stakeholders, the different key targets and timeframes, as well as the communication of future planning processes. For those of you with a NAP, I do want to stress that the NAP is a planning document, whereas an INDC is a communications document. So while much of the content can be transferable, it is inherently different, and the objectives of these 2 documents are different, in that the INDC is communicating on adaptation. So to go into Chile as an example, I've tried to break it down into the approach that they used, the different resources they used to build this approach from, and then the next slide we'll talk about the targets. So Chile's approach is they committed to a planned adaptation approach, and which means they defined what adaptation meant to them and how they were going to approach it. And a planned adaptation approach means that it's a result of a deliberate policy decision, and it's based on awareness that conditions have changed or are about to change, and that action is required to achieve a desired state. So they put up front their adaptation approach. They also drew quite a bit from existing policy strategy and implementation processes, and a lot of this will have come from their NAP. They already also, as you can see in the resources, have developed 2 sectoral plans for adaptation. And something that Chile did, which was quite unique and set a bit of a precedent, is that their Office of Climate Change and Environmental Education Division with the Ministry of Environment undertook a public consultation process. along with different educational workshops about the INDC process and presentations for their ministries. So Chile has not actually submitted their INDC. So far, they've only released a draft of their INDC, but they put this draft open for consultation by the Chilean public, which is quite unique and hasn't been done before. And so using this approach and drawing on the resources they had, the targets that Chile were able to develop is they would like to have 9 sectoral adaptation plans for priority sectors, 2 of which they've already completed. As you can see here, the sectoral plan for biodiversity and the sectoral plan for agroforestry adaptation. They need sources of finance for those plans, concrete actions to increase the resilience of the country, methodologies and indicators for vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and resilience, and identification of 4 key stages on adaptation efforts. And to go back a little to Anna's presentation, I think most of these are quite qualitative. And you can look at the first one, 9 sectoral adaptation plans for priority sectors would be an example of a process-based target. And now moving on to the second category, which I think most of you seem to identify with, which is countries that may lack a NAP, but maybe you have a national climate change adaptation strategy already in place, or something similar. So you can use these resources to perhaps look at your existing goals and objectives and further develop them in your INDC, look at any intended plans and processes, the prevailing data collection and current analysis, and given the time and resources, perhaps you would like to undertake some new analytical efforts, although this is by no means a requirement. So the inclusion of these options is going to vary depending on the time that your country has, the resources that your country has, the funding, and any existing knowledge on climate resilience. So depending on what your adaptation strategy is, or if you may only have an overarching climate strategy, the INDC is going to look different. I know Emmanuel talked to you quite a bit yesterday about South Africa, so I'll probably make this brief to not be completely repetitive. But their approach, like Chile, they drew on existing policy, strategy, and implementation processes. They mapped the governance arrangements for adaptation, and they looked at goals for mainstreaming their adaptation into their development policy, which I think is quite important. They also undertook an assessment of the needs and costs for their priority sectors in South Africa, and they attempted to quantify adaptations investments for the past 5 years. So it's quite a thorough approach. And the resources that they used to do this were their National Climate Change Response White Paper, long-term adaptation scenarios projects, which they've had going on for a number of years, and the National Environmental Management Act. So these are some of the key documents they drew on to formulate this approach. And it's important to note that South Africa also hasn't submitted their INDC. They submitted a draft for comment, not public consultation. And most of the information in my presentation now and Emmanuel's presentation was taken from a presentation by John Kekana at the Regional Technical Dialogues on INDC in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And targets weren't separately represented in this presentation, but going through it, we've pulled some out. So South Africa has stated they would like to develop a guidance framework for meeting these adaptation obligations and for identifying key sectors producing incremental adaptation costs and needs for 2020 to 2030. And I would expect these targets to become a little bit more fleshed out and more clear once they've submitted their INDC. And then we move on to the final and third category, countries with a limited, perhaps low quality, or maybe an outdated adaptation strategy. But these countries still have options for developing their INDCs, and it can lay the groundwork, perhaps, this INDC, for potentially developing a future NAP process or a future adaptation strategy. So in order to do this, you could outline the potential planning processes you'd like to undertake, develop a timeline for this, and begin to summarize any available climate vulnerability data that you may have access to or you may have available, or any programs. and also undertake a review of what you already have, any existing adaptation strategies that might already be in place, if any. Given the limited time frame and resources, the basic approach doesn't require necessarily extensive new data or analysis, and it can still result in an INDC. And this also goes back to what Anna was saying in her presentation, is that even if you have limited resources, it can still be important to include adaptation in your INDC to make that move from planning to action and to contribute to this kind of knowledge sharing platform where you can share the lessons you've learned or the challenges that you faced in developing it. And the country we used here is Gabon for the example. Now, it's important to note that Gabon actually does have a national adaptation strategy. But we chose to use them because even so, they maybe better fit into this category of having limited, outdated, or low-quality strategies available to them. So the approach that Gabon used is they also, like the previous two, built upon existing policy. They are attempting to establish a legal framework, monitoring tools, as well as training and information, and primarily for coastal adaptation. That is Gabon's main focus. So we are talking about different sectors that your INDC could potentially focus on. Gabon focuses solely on the coastal sector. And also they would like to include territories in the exclusive economic zone in their national adaptation actions. And the resources they used were the National Adaptation Strategy for Coastal Zone Management, their national communications documents, as well as the Africa Adaptation Program. And the targets that they developed was they established a development plan for coastal urban areas, which included conservation projects, waste management, and monitoring evaluations. Their target is to develop conservation projects for mangroves, for coastal protection and species protection, establish specific facilities for coastal waste management, nesting marine turtles, and a coastal observatory, and establish a national fund for sustainable development with a focus on the state budget, private investment, donor contributions, and loans. And this last target is a great example of what a needs-based target could look like. Because Gabon did choose to focus on the coastal management sector, their goals are actually quite specific in this regard. So, if you have any questions, I think that's my presentation. I'll leave the floor open now, and then afterwards we will move you into a group discussion.
Thank you for the good presentation, Skylar. I just have one question, and maybe it's more for the whole table. To what extent do you see the INDCs could be linked up to the work going on with technology needs assessments? I think my reason for asking this is that it's my impression that I don't have the full overview of countries being present here, but it is a process going on in many of the countries which have been finished a few years back or is starting up now. And these technology needs assessments prioritize among focus areas for adaptation and also develop specific technology action plans in terms of their prioritized technologies. And of course this is focused on technologies, but the definition of technologies would be quite close to what you, I suppose, define as adaptation options. So to what extent could the INDCs be linked up to the processes with TNAs, so to say?
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I can take it. I think, as we will return to this afternoon, that if your country has been involved in this technology needs assessment, that provides an excellent basis actually for putting up some targets and needs, identified needs, also in terms of technology, of capacity and technology and international finance needed to achieve these targets. So there's again no rules around what the countries should or should not do or should include or not include, but of course, as you also mentioned, the definition of technologies is so broad that it's basically almost equivalent to adaptation. So obviously if there's already a process in place or TNAs have been undertaken, there would be a wealth of information to draw from there. So definitely TNAs can be used. We haven't seen any examples yet in the INDC submitted where they refer to their TNAs. I don't know why. Maybe the ministries involved are not the same that are involved in the INDC process, and it also underlines the need for very comprehensive process at the national level to ensure that all available information and ongoing processes and studies are used to the extent possible. But in many cases, it will actually be also the national communications, and many countries are working on the third national communications now, where they have where sort of key areas, key needs, key risks are already identified. And linking that up to any other information on a technology needs or other needs would be also a very good way of doing it in sort of a cost-efficient and time-efficient manner, I think.
I would also note that in the INDC guidance note that we included for adaptation, there is an example in there of the Mauritius TNA and how they can use this, for example, when they make their INDC to document any technical support that they might already have, because they go over a very detailed overview of all the adaptation current projects that they have in the country and the technologies that they're using to implement them. So that could be quite a good example. I'd also like to note that this presentation, we've put it in the entry points section in our guidance note as a big table. So if you want to refer to it, and it also includes a very big list of potential national documents that you could use for INDC development. So I would ask you also to refer to that in our guidance note. It could be very useful.